Charles Webster Leadbeater was a British theosophist. Born in 1854 in Stockport, Cheshire, Leadbeater couldn't afford college and so worked at various jobs, meanwhile supplanting his education by extensive reading, including the study of Latin, French, and Greek. In 1883, his interest in theosophy led him to join the Theosophical Society. His meeting with Helena Blavatsky also resulted in him in becoming her pupil and a vegetarian. In 1885, he travelled to Myanmar and then Sri Lanka with Henry Steele Olcott, first president of the Theosophical Society, helping him to found the English Buddhist Academy in Sri Lanka, which would later become the Ananda College. Around 1886, he claimed to have developed clairvoyant abilities. In 1906, he was booted out of the Theosophical Society for advising boys to masturbate to relieve obsessive sexual desires, only being readmitted in 1909. That same year, he encountered Jiddu Krishnamurti, a 14-year-old boy from India, whom he convinced that he was in fact a vehicle for the messianic entity of the world teacher. Thereafter, Leadbeater set about to chronicle Krishnamurti's past lives, ranging from 22,662 BC to 624 AD. Krishnamurti eventually told the Theosophists to stuff it and to leave him alone. In 1915, Leadbeater moved to Sydney, and he remained active in Theosophy and the Reformed Christian Church movements until his death due to diabetes in March 1934. I do not wish to engage in any sort of psychoanalysis of the man, but I will simply state that the summary of his life seems far more interesting than a volume of fiction written by him, a man with supposed expert knowledge of the hereafter. Indeed, The Perfume of Egypt and Other Weird Stories, the subject of this review, seems to be the only fiction title in Leadbeater's bibliography of more than 60 books, and as a consequence the tales presented herein are not very well developed or refined. The title story, The Perfume of Egypt, details how a man once ran across a most peculiar smell while travelling in Egypt, which is said to be connected to the supernatural. The smell, not Egypt. The descriptions of his discovery thereof and the protest of his Egyptian acquaintance when he wishes to acquire some of the stuff for his own use work well, but the bulk of the story is actually a dead simple warning/help offered by a ghost story, which, even in far more experienced hands, has suffered quite a lot of contempt. Think of how many times one has seen a variety on having a conversation with someone who is later revealed, shock of shocks and horror of horrors, to have been dead. Nothing else. No ghastly revelation, nothing whatsoever disturbing or incredible. Just the fact one has just conversed rather plainly and normally with someone, and it has since turned out that someone was a ghost. And it had no effect on the nature of the conversation for the most part. The story in question, if it must be summarized further, deals with the narrator visiting his family friend, and with the aid of a piece of paper handed to him by a ghost, they manage to find his friend's ancestors' hidden treasure, which will allow the narrator's friend to be able to marry. A reference is made to something which the ghost wishes to be done in complete secrecy to atone for his sins, and sadly, Leadbeater thinks that concealing the one possibly interesting thing in the second part of this story will somehow equal excitement. Sadly, the intriguing-sounding title of the story, the whole book seems like little more than a cheat, though I suppose the hidden room with a skull and some gold in it infernally wouldn't have nearly had as much punch. Following this story, as with most of the others, there is a short, didactic discussion by Leadbeater on the thoughts and motives of the ghosts in question, which help to further drive any suspense or feeling of unease the story might have otherwise evoked firmly into the ground. The second story, The Forsaken Temple, is the first time when one notices just how undeveloped certain of these stories are. In this case, we have a teacher who is in the habit of using two choristers who happen to be twins as mediums for his seances. Then one night, he and one of the boys have a shared hallucination of some large Egyptian temple, and the voice says that one of the boys must not be mesmerized. And that's it. The vivid imagery of the temple is built up just so that it can be of no use whatsoever, and the only point of this all seems to be to persuade the story's narrator to forbid one of the boys to take part in a session with a hypnotist. No reason is ever even given as to why the boy must, quote, not be mesmerized, and the author, be it Leadbeater or the narrator, never chooses to even speculate on one. The Major's promises all the worse for its nauseating mediocrity in that the author claims it is a reworking of a story from Catherine Crowe's The Night Side of Nature. I have not read this book, but it seems astounding that Leadbeater would run across this story and then endeavour to retell it, and yet leave it so utterly, horribly tedious and predictable. Not to mention lacking in thrills of any kind. In short, while on a hunting trip, a major promises his companions to catch up with them, but he falls in a well and dies, and as he does so, his companions hear church bells and see him coming on board their boat, but contrary to all expectations, when they go and check, he's not really there. I have to wonder about the quality of the original work, if this is an improved version, or indeed wonder how such a simple story needed or in fact could even be quote-unquote retold. A Test of Courage is once again half a story, if that. The narrator randomly hears himself called in sleep and, leaving his body, ascends into the air, lands on a nearby island, sees a ghost that looks like his mother, but isn't, according to the speculations Leadbeater goes on about in his story addendum, and then there are a bunch of dinosaurs who pass in front of the narrator, doing nothing until one spits red goop all over him and leaves. And then at the end he finds a feather on the ground. The imagery at the beginning is good, despite the narrator abandoning the desire to describe the passing monstrosities immediately, and rather annoyingly, though he at least describes the last one in more detail, still there is little rhyme or reason as to why any of this happened. Following yet another didactic mini-lecture by Leadbeater, we get to the supposed writer of the book, written as a collection of quote-unquote true experiences by a fictional overall narrator. However, this is so confusingly executed that referencing just which narrator is speaking when would be far too confusing. To introduce his friend the bishop to us so he can recount two horrifically tedious stories from the bishop's life. In a triple warning, the ghost of the bishop's father appears to him as he is dying, you guessed it, 3 times. That is all. In the concealed confession, the bishop finds the totally beneficent ghost of a priest who asks him to destroy a written confession he had left in the house before dying. The bishop does so, and despite the fact it has been about 80 years since the confession was written, and thus all the concerned persons would be long dead by then, we never actually get to hear what it was all about. How mundane this seems when compared with someone like Henry S. Whitehead, also a priest in a Christian church, who, apart from his many tales of voodoo hauntings in the Virgin Islands, also wrote a very similar story called The Fireplace, which involved a dead body, a burning building, and some actual cleverness of writing. Jagannath, A Tale of Hidden India, is Leadbeater giving a terribly brief account of the worship of Jagannath, an Indian god fashioned into the shape of a tree stump. Despite getting some of the details right, or at least getting very close to doing so, there is one major fault besides the story being a handful of pages long and not being an actual story but a short lesson. And that is the fact that Leadbeater claims the deity is a malignant, destructive human sacrifice requiring earth elemental, which is not true at all, as even the most basic research will show. The mental image of the wooden stump hopping out of the temple in giant leaps is one of the most hilarious things I've ever been asked to imagine, and it does not lend itself to much suspense at all. The Baron's room is apparently not Leadbeater's story at all, but a story recounted by Madame Blavatsky at some point in the past. Seeing as it has much more a story-like structure, I am inclined to believe it. Still, we're dealing with typical people venture into infamous haunted house for the night on purpose territory, and the thing is very, very mundane. The spirit itself takes the time to take on the physical appearance of one of the two adventurers, just so he can run about the room like someone who had way too much coffee, only to then slit his throat again, as he committed suicide in this way originally in front of the narrator, only to then leave him completely unharmed until morning when he leaves. Seems like rather a waste of time, if you ask me. The final and longest story is saved by a ghost. This is basically little else than an adventure story of a father, his son, and their slave-turned-freedman assistant running through the jungle trying to avoid a dangerous rebel and his forces while he plans to sack a nearby town. The town doesn't even get sacked as they alert the authorities, and really the supernatural in this case seems rather tacked on. At one point Martinez, the rebel general, demands the narrator and his father and brother to renounce Christianity by stepping on a cross and swearing allegiance to him, because he likes to be very heavy-handed and also doesn't have anything to do, apparently. Not considering the safety of his 7-year-old brother at all, the 12-year-old narrator yells at him to not give in and to remember a story of a martyr girl they had heard not too long before, and thus gets his little brother killed. Instead of being guilt-ridden about his stupidity, the boy ends up being glad he did it, and when he is tortured by Martinez's men, his little brother's ghost shows up, not to provide any sort of help, mind you, but just to show up and leave. At the very end, the ghost stops his elder brother from killing Martinez, but at that point both brothers had shot countless South American natives before they got kidnapped, so there is not much of a salvation through supernatural means to be found here. The most quote-unquote notable part of the story is the horrible racism the narrator displays towards South American native peoples and people of mixed ancestry. He also writes how sometimes people of mixed ancestry will exhibit the worst traits of both parent races, a line that Henry S. Whitehead also used in his works. However, Whitehead not only could write, despite his tendency to refer to native beliefs as stupidness, was not insulting, and he certainly never wrote of black people as Leadbeater wrote of South American Indians, quote-unquote. To quote a specific line, "Next came the Red Indians, the earlier lords of the soil. Of these many tribes had adopted a kind of squalid semi-civilization, but many others were still savages, untamed and untamable. Men who regarded work of any kind as the deepest degradation." And then there is a line so horribly jaw-droppingly arrogant that I at first had to stop and reread it again slowly just to make sure I was actually reading correctly. Namely that, to quote, "It will no doubt be incomprehensible to many of us that a half-naked savage can entertain any other feeling than envy for our superior civilization, however much he may dislike us." This rather major flaw helps to make the only truly interesting-ish story in the collection rather hard to stomach. Overall, the book itself leaves a lot to be desired. Most of the stories are underdeveloped, the supernatural is presented in a rather low-key, mundane way, and there are few moments of actual thrill or atmosphere to speak of. It seems Leadbeater never wrote another work of fiction after publishing this book, and I can say I'm all too distraught about it.